It is very early. The sun has just about risen. I've had my morning espresso, and I have a plan. For this video, I challenge myself to read 5 books by the end of the day. But I think I might freshen up first. That's better. So like I said, 5 books, 1 day. Now, I know how quickly I read, which is not very quickly. So to make this challenge actually possible and actually fun and actually something worth doing, I've picked 5 books that are pretty small. These 5 books are about 100 pages each, and I've picked a nice variety here as well to keep things interesting. There's a classic Japanese thriller, a collection of Grace Nichols's poems, a German horror story, a queer science fiction novella, and a collection of short stories about Einstein that my partner recommended I read. You're coming with me for this whole journey. I'm going to read these books one at a time and vlog about them and give you my thoughts as I go. I think I'm going to start with the Japanese thriller because it's the shortest book on the pile, so it's going to make me feel like I'm actually getting through this at a decent pace to start off with. And also because it's a thriller, it's going to be an intense page turner, so it's going to put me in a reading mood. I assume this challenge is going to take me right up to nightfall, so I should probably leave the German horror story for last. And I can imagine reading Grace Nichols's poetry somewhere in the middle as a kind of prose palate cleanser. Alright, 5 books, 1 day, let's go. Okay, got my comfy corner, got my blanket, headphones, and I have picked this to start with. This, by the way, is a newly republished, in English translation, Japanese classic thriller. It's called Beast in the Shadow by Edogawa Rampo, and it's been translated into English by Ian Hughes. Let's dig in. Okay, I'm halfway through this, and it was a really good choice for first book for the exact reasons that I said. But when I read murder mysteries and thrillers, I like to try and guess what's actually going on and what the twist is going to be. And I have a theory for this, so I'm telling you now to hold myself accountable to find out if I was right. Here's my theory. Wait, no, first, this is what the book's about. Beast in the Shadow is a short murder mystery thriller that is told from the perspective of a crime writer. Our narrator protagonist is a relatively famous writer, and he prides himself on writing clever murder mystery stories. But there's this other guy who also writes murder mysteries, but his are more pulpy and disgusting and gruesome and from the perspective and the mind of a killer. Whereas our protagonist writes more detective tales. Think Poirot versus true crime, I guess. At the beginning of the story, he's at a museum, and he starts chatting with this beautiful young married woman, who turns out to be a fan of his. The two of them chat, and then they agree to exchange letters. But eventually, during those exchanges over the course of months and months, she reveals to him that she's being stalked. Her stalker was a lover that she briefly had as a teenager, and she broke off their relationship when she realized that he was a little bit creepy. She ended up then marrying a really successful businessman, and her old stalker from her teenage years has come back to threaten her, follow her, and send her really terrifying letters. And she reveals very early on to our protagonist that her stalker is in fact this other author that our protagonist hates. And thus we have a kind of cat and mouse game. One author is acting as detective, another author is acting as criminal, and the woman is caught in between as a potential victim. My theory is this. That's my theory. Now I'm going to finish it. Let's see if I was right. Okay, first book done. And I was right. I was bloody right. This was a surprisingly dense read for something that's just a 90-ish page murder mystery story. So I think the next thing I'm going to read is the poetry collection. What's interesting about this is that it has that classic tone to it, where if you've read a lot of classics, say Bronte books or Jane Austen books, you know that wordiness was often a thing. Like, the author uses so much language to express points that could have been summed up more neatly with fewer words and sentences. And also, again, something that is almost a cliche when it comes to a lot of classics is people drop dead way too easily. Really early in this book, we learn about the woman who's being stalked by a brief former lover. Her dad drops dead out of stress. Like, this was such a thing in so many classics, and it happens here. Her dad can't deal with the stress of his daughter being stalked by someone and how that's disrupting their life, and so he just gets sick and dies. I love that so much. Without going into spoilers about what this book reveals and all the twists and turns. I will say that it is very much of its time, and a point that the author seems to be trying to make as a man writing at the turn of the 20th century in Japan is that maybe we shouldn't underestimate the women folk. And actually, women are kind of like people. And that's kind of what he's trying to say, I think. But this was a really, really fun mystery, and another thing that kind of makes it unique as a mystery story is that our protagonist is a writer of crime and murder mystery fiction, not a police detective, not a sleuth, not a private investigator, not someone who is a professional when it comes to this stuff, but rather someone who writes fantastical fiction about this stuff, being thrown into it and playing the role of the sleuth. And I think that's really, really fun. You don't ever see that. I can't think of a time when I've ever read a crime story where the protagonist is a crime story writer. That was cool. But it also means that, in a very, very fun way, he is guilty of flights of fancy. He comes up with theories and ideas about what this could be, and those theories and ideas only really work within fiction because that's what he knows. But then again, this is fiction, and he's a fictional character within that narrative. So it's fun to write a protagonist who is fanciful in his ideas and his theories. That was really, really cool. I really recommend this. Japanese crime fiction is legendary. There are so many great Japanese crime authors, and I've done multiple videos and written whole articles about these different writers, and I'd never read this one before. Also, Edogawa Rampo is an anagram of Edgar Allan Poe, or at least half of it. He took like half of Edgar Allan Poe's name and turned it into this name, and that's just great. Good for him. Anyway, I'm going to track down more of his stories. This was really, really fun. Next up, a collection of Grace Nichols's poetry, then lunch. All done. So I've never read Grace Nichols before. I was talking to my partner about this, how they had read her poetry when they were at school, and I never did. It's kind of luck of the draw when it comes to poetry at school. But I fixed that now, and this was really, really powerful. This was her second collection, and it was published in the 80s, and it's called The Fat Black Woman's Poems. It's divided into a few different sections, and the tone shifts from section to section. The first section, for example, is called The Fat Black Woman's Poems, and these poems are full of joy. They are a celebration of the body, of black bodies, of fat bodies, and of fat black bodies. They're really funny, they're sweet, there's a sense of irony to some of them, and they made me laugh out loud. The second collection is called In Spite of Ourselves, and it takes on a slightly more serious tone. It's like she goes from laughing to gritting her teeth a little bit, and those poems are more about the relationship between black culture and Britishness, because Grace Nichols is a black woman originally from Guyana, and she's lived in the UK since, I think, the late 70s. And so she writes a lot about the relationship between British culture, Caribbean culture, whiteness and blackness. Some of it is joyous, maybe tinted with sadness, but the shift between these two sections of poetry is really, really satisfying. It's not intense and jarring. It kind of makes sense as an emotional shift. The third section is about memories, and she talks a lot about her mother and her childhood. And then the fourth section is actually taken from her first poetry collection. That collection won the Commonwealth Poetry Prize in the early 80s, and some of those poems appear here, which is really cool. So as I said, there is a shift between joy and moroseness. Is that a word? There's a beauty to everything in here, no matter the emotion that's being expressed. But what I valued most about it was that gentle switch in feeling, from celebration to acceptance to nostalgia. Gorgeous. I'm going to read more of her poetry, and I'm so glad I checked this out. That was my morning. 2 books down, one surprisingly heavy given its length, and another a beautiful palette cleanser of really, really gorgeous poetry. Through the afternoon and the evening, I'm going to read these 3. But now, I really need some lunch and my third coffee of the day. Nipped out for coffee, lunchtime, then back to it. Actually decided to watch an episode of Community with lunch, then back to it. Okay, lunch over, now it's time for book 3. This is Pluralities by Avi Silver. This is a short, queer science fiction book that was actually recently sent to me by the publisher. That publisher is Athis Arts, and they're based out of Detroit, Michigan. They were apparently bowled over by this book and really, really excited to send it to me, so I've got very high hopes. Queer science fiction. Excellent. All done. So like I said, the publisher sent me this and they were very, very excited, and I get it. Pluralities is really, really good. What's curious is that, well, I guess this often happens. We have a certain idea of what a book is going to be based on the blurb or the marketing material or hearsay. The blurb describes this book as a dual narrative about a young person who is assigned female at birth and is coming to realize certain things about their gender identity. And the other person is someone who is flying around the galaxy in a ship and has escaped from their home planet for some reason. And the blurb also hints at these two eventually meeting. Somehow their stories will overlap, and so you picture crash landings or wormholes or interdimensional smushing. Something. But no, not really. The two narratives are connected on a thematic level and kind of a psychic one-ish, maybe, for a moment. But for the most part, they are two separate narratives. The first narrative is written in the first person. As I said, we have a young person who at the beginning of the book is going by she and presenting as a woman, who works at kind of a cosmetics shop in a shopping mall, and who also has the power of foresight, provided they touch someone. Their job is to sell skincare products, and while they're rubbing these things into customers' skin to show how good these products are, they get a flash into that person's future, something that's going to happen to them at some point. And at the end of the first chapter, their boss touches them, and they get a flash into like 5 minutes from now where they quit their job. And then they emerge from that moment of psychic clarity and go, oh good, I'm going to quit. I quit, and then hand over their stuff. From there, they get picked up by someone that they vaguely know who works at the shopping mall, who turns out to be a transgender man, and the two of them become really good friends and eventually enter a sexual relationship. They spend all of their time having sex and playing video games, mostly Stardew Valley. The other narrative is a prince who has escaped his home planet and all of his responsibilities and his destiny. He and his sentient AI ship are just flying out into the galaxy to escape and explore. You follow on a little adventure as the two of them get closer, and you come to realize that the AI that controls the ship is actually in love with the prince. And it's very clear early on what the narrative thematic overlap is between these two stories. They are both people who are exploring freedom and moving outside of what has been presented to them, forced upon them. For almost every human being on Earth, we are presented with a gender binary. You are male, you are female, and our protagonist is figuring out that they might not be that. The prince has been given a destiny, he's been given responsibilities, and he doesn't want that, so he escapes. He wants to live a hedonistic life, and our non-binary protagonist wants to live a life outside of the gender binary. And you watch what that means for each of our characters. Primarily, this is a transgender story. It's a story of coming out. It's a story of exploring yourself and figuring out who and what you are. For one character, that means having the support of a loving transgender man who is already a bit more experienced in this area. And for the other, it means having a sentient AI ship that is slowly falling in love with them. It's really cool. I'm super impressed by this. A really, really great science fiction transgender story. It's about 120 pages long, and I enjoyed every page, every chapter. Really, really satisfying stuff. And written with a pleasing maturity that certainly doesn't lack youthful vibrancy and comedy. Next up is The Black Spider. As someone who absolutely loves horror and the gothic, this has been my most anticipated book of this list, and that's probably not a big surprise to most people. It's published by MYRB Classics, and they always publish really great stuff. This book was originally published in 1842, and it was written by Swiss-German writer Jeremias Gottlieb. It's translated from the German into English by Susan Bonofsky, and I'm really excited to give it a go. It's almost exactly 100 pages long. Let's check it out. This is a lot. I've talked a lot about how so many of my favourite books are classic pieces of gothic fiction. Frankenstein, Wuthering Heights, Dracula, Dorian Gray, etc, etc. This is in that field, but it is wild. And because I love that genre so much, I will freely admit that it can be a lot, and it can be very confusing and a little bit too dense when it comes to language and plotting and structure and the expression of ideas and just dialogue and descriptive language, it can all be so much. And again, that's all really true here. This is only 100 pages, but I felt like I was reading it for a long time. I'm tired. I will say that it's impossible to ignore the religious allegory going on here. The whole point of this novella is just to remind people to worship God, to behave yourself and be a God-fearing Christian. But it does so in a really gnarly, horror-tinged gothic medieval way. It's nuts. Like many gothic novels, it is a story within a story within a story. It has a framing device, which takes up the first quarter of the novel. It's set in an idyllic valley in Switzerland where a small community are celebrating the christening of a new child. There's an old man who's lived in this one house for ever, and during the christening, he's staring at this one blackened old plank of wood that's part of the house's structure. And the rest of the community say to him, "Go on, Grandad, tell us the story about the plank of wood. We know you want to." And he goes, "Okay, children, gather around, but you're not going to like the story and it's going to scare you and blah, blah, blah." And yeah, no, it's real scary. We then get thrown back into the medieval period where a local lord orders all of the serfs to build him a massive castle on a hill. He's got a bunch of knights under his thrall who make sure that the serfs toe the line. They build the castle and then they're really tired. And he says, one more thing. Now you all need to fill a nice courtyard full of trees, and that's going to take them a certain amount of time, and all the peasants know that if they do it, they will starve because they won't have time to farm for themselves. But they don't have any choice. Then this mysterious hunter, a guy with a red beard who's dressed all in green, tempts them all into accepting his help. He will fix everything. He will solve their problem. But his payment is the next child that is born, and it must be unbaptized. They say no, then they suffer, then he comes back, then they say yes, and they try to trick him in a very Greek mythology way. They try to keep tricking him by anticipating the birth of a new child and then getting it baptized before he can come along and take it, and they do that a few times. It's nuts. It's absolutely wild. I don't want to spoil what happens. This hunter guy is very obviously the devil, and he's here to tempt the village. And shit goes wild. It's insane what happens in this story. But here, the religious allegory of it just kind of soured it for me because it's such a boring message. Behave yourself and be afraid of God. No, thank you. All that said, it's still a really wild story. Like, truly insane. Castle of Otranto levels of insanity. Next, I'm going to read a short story collection that takes place inside Einstein's head. Wish me luck. I am very tired. It's 8:30 at night. This is my 5th cup of coffee. 5 books, 5 cups of coffee. And this broke me. Insert a joke about Chidi trying to wrap his head around Jeremy Bearimy. Einstein's Dreams is real great, and it's real simple to try to explain, but it certainly must not have been simple to write. This is an author using Einstein as a vessel to explore various scientific what-ifs. The prologue begins with Einstein sitting in the patent office doing his daily job, and every night he has a dream, and each of those dreams imagines a different scenario that has something to do with time, something to do with our relationship to our understanding of our universe. He imagines 1,000 different what-if scenarios when it comes to time. There are a few different interludes throughout the book, and each of those interludes reminds us that we are in the world, in the life of Einstein in 1905, while he was working at the Swiss Patent Office. And all the way through the book, you've got lots of different what-ifs. Every chapter is a small vignette, usually around 3 to 5 pages long, that just presents us with an idea. What if the world was like X? For example, there is one really funny one early on that posits the idea that because time slows down the further you are from a center of gravity, what if there's a world where all of society, all of human civilization has migrated to the tops of mountains so that people can live as long as possible? People live in houses on mile-high stilts on the tops of mountains, and the people who live on the very highest points lord it over everyone else. I'm gonna live longer. I will look younger forever. I won't lose my hair. I will keep my virility. All of these things. But there are people who have given up on those flights of fancy. They live down in the valleys and they are free of all of those constraints. They don't care about aging more quickly. They are free of that burden. Another one posits the idea of a world where effect doesn't follow cause, or at least there is no way to track cause and effect. Maybe effect comes before cause, or long, long after. In this world, everyone is honest with each other. There's no such thing as consequence. Science is completely pointless because scientists can't prove anything through cause and effect, but artists are having a whale of a time because the chaos of the universe inspires really crazy art, literature, and music. That's cool. There's another really sad one where people are able to find the center of time, and at the center of time, everything stops. And the people who search for the center of time are people who don't want time to continue for them. Usually they're parents who don't want to see their kids grow up, learn about the world, get sick, maybe die. But eventually these people might spend centuries in an embrace frozen in the center of time, but will inevitably leave, and the world that they end up going back to is not the one that they left. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was amazing. This was just one author who clearly has a pretty decent knowledge of time and physics and wanted to explore that through the mind of Einstein. That's how he frames it. That's how he grounds his ideas and his what-ifs. I really liked it. But it also broke me. I'm really tired and I'm drinking coffee at 8:30 at night. And I got a busy day tomorrow. Okay, I'm done. Subscribe for books.